in multimodal transportation in urban context for the year 2015. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to especially thank Corinne Kistner from NACTO and Emma Yamamoto from the Committee on Major Cities for helping coordinate all of this. I'll start and introduce all our speakers for today. It was definitely challenging to address all multimodal performance measurements within an hour, especially because this area is constantly expanding and the number of measures is increasing. So it was important to have someone who could speak about all urban street performance metrics in general and who could cover it all. And this is why Jamie Parks from the City of Oakland is our speaker today. Jamie is a Complete Street Program Manager in Oakland, the author of Philadelphia Complete Streets Handbook. He holds a master's degree in transportation engineering from Northwestern University. And he was also the driving force behind a great workshop that was hosted by the committee during the annual meeting titled The Art of Urban Street Performance Metrics, which inspired us to dedicate one of the webinars to performance measurement. Then it was also important to have a presenter today who could speak about safety, because we always want safety to come first. And this is why Eric Hanss, a pedestrian program manager from Chicago DOT, is with us today. Eric is also involved with Active Transportation Alliance, and he graduated from the University of Chicago. He's urban data specialist, and I had the opportunity to visit Chicago 2 months ago and discuss all the safety improvements that are happening out there. So it's going to be great to hear what Eric has to say today. It was also important to bring in one of the new performance measures, and one of the measures that is emerging is the effect that transportation has on public health. So Dr. Shaunna Burbidge from Active Planning is here today, and she's an expert in modeling the connections between built environment, transportation, and public health. Shaunna is the founder of Active Planning. She holds a PhD from UC Santa Barbara in geography, focused on transportation. She also worked as an assistant professor and researcher at the University of Utah and Brigham Young University, and she serves as a special advisor to CDC Office of Sustainability. So these are our speakers. We will have 3 presentations. Each speaker will spend about 15 minutes presenting, and then at the end, after they're done, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So Jamie, thanks for being here, and you're the first presenter.
Okay, thanks, Ivana. So as Ivana mentioned, I'm going to try to summarize a workshop that we had at TRB last year, which is about a 3-hour workshop. I'm going to summarize some of the key points in about 15 minutes. So it's we're leaving a lot of the details out, but hopefully summarizing some of the more salient points from that discussion. So as Ivana mentioned, I work with the City of Oakland, and I put this picture on the front page not only because it's a beautiful picture of Oakland, but also because I think it symbolizes a lot of what we're talking about today. Because this is a project where we removed a small section of freeway and replaced it with a surface street and a park. And the road now moves a fewer cars, but that really wasn't the point of the project. And if we'd assessed the project based only on level of service, we never would have done it. And you know, this is one of the most successful projects that the City of Oakland has ever done. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit of the state of the current practice with respect to performance measurements and some of the things that we do wrong on a regular basis in transportation. Discuss some of the alternatives to the current paradigm, and then give a quick Oakland case study of a recent example where we've used a slightly different approach to performance metrics to get to a different outcome on a project. So to start with, far and away the most common performance metrics used in transportation, despite all the flaws that we know about it, is level of service, which is a measure of vehicle delay. And I'd like to suggest that probably the biggest problem with vehicle delay isn't that we measure it. Vehicle delay may be an important input. I think the biggest problem is putting it into a level of service scale, an A through F scale, where F is failure. The concept of failure is borrowed from other civil engineering jurisdictions. And when a bridge fails, people die. But when a traffic signal fails, people wait for a few more seconds. And it's quite a bit different. And you know, so vehicle delay failure is not really something to be avoided at all costs in the same way. It needs to be balanced against other objectives, against safety, against pedestrian comfort, against the ability to bicycle down a street. And by phrasing it in the term of failure, we were giving additional weight to this single performance metric and leaving everything else out. Not only that, the most common way in which we measure level of service is the peak 15 minutes of the day. So for people that aren't traffic engineers, when people apply the peak hour factor, what that really means is that you're looking at just the peak 15 minutes of the entire day. And the vast majority of level of service analyses that are done across the country still look at the peak 15 minutes of the day and ignore the other 23 hours and 45 minutes of the day. To compound that problem, it's very common in many locations, and particularly for state DOTs, to actually look at the 30th highest hour of the year, which is something that's recommended by AASHTO. And so when you combine the peak 15 minutes of the day with the 30th highest hour of the year, you end up designing for less than 0.1% of the time. And that's simply inefficient. It's a waste of space when we have precious urban real estate that can be used for any number of purposes. You end up with streets like this that are empty most of the time and could be used for any number of other things. And the final issue that I wanted to bring up with the current state of practice is what I would say is an over-reliance on future year forecasts. One, I would argue that we don't know as much about what traffic is going to be like in 25 years as models would suggest. They give us a single point forecast that says the traffic will grow 2% a year, 3% a year. But the reality is that for the last 10 years or so, we've been seeing a decrease in traffic. So it's unrealistic to think that traffic is just going to increase indefinitely into the future. And it results in poor projects when we design our streets to accommodate growth that may or may not ever happen. And then the result really is that we're designing for a worst case scenario. This is an example from Oakland that I would say is an example of doing this wrong, where we have a shared lane here because the traffic volume forecast for 2040 say that in 25 years, we'll need 2 lanes on this street. I would argue that it's just paint, and if in fact in 25 years we did need an extra lane, we could always go back and add it, but it doesn't make sense to sit around and have an inadequate bicycle facility for the next 25 years waiting to see if the traffic materializes or not. So what can we do instead? There are hundreds of available performance measures out there, published in lots of different guides. In fact, there's so many performance measures that it's difficult to keep track of them and certainly impossible to use all of them. I would suggest that the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide has a section on performance metrics that helps provide a framework for how you can select performance metrics that help you get to outcomes that you want and identify some key performance metrics. But I think one of the key principles to doing urban street performance metrics correctly is to think about what you're really trying to achieve on the street. And in most cases, what we're trying to achieve on urban streets, we want to have streets that are safe. We want to have streets that are attractive. We want to have streets where people want to be. And so if those are your city's goals, and my guess is that they are your city's goals, then that's what you should be measuring. And I think that the New York City DOT's Sustainable Streets reports are really the model for the country in doing that, and got a snapshot here of one of those presentations, or one of the pages from their reports, where the performance metrics really are looking at safety, and they're looking at economic vitality, and they're looking at whether or not people like the street better, and 75% of people prefer the configuration, and that's key information. Also looking at mode split targets can be really important for kind of long-range planning or understanding where you're trying to go from a policy perspective. City of Portland has established very aggressive mode targets where bicycling is supposed to be a quarter of all trips in 20 years. That suggests a very different approach to building roads if you're going to achieve that goal. And then I'd also mention that one of the nice things about safety is that it really is complementary between all modes. So often bicycle and pedestrian improvements are seen as taking away something from people in cars. And what it's taking away is their ability to drive really quickly down the street. But the bicycle and pedestrian improvements are generally complementary with motor vehicle safety as well. So when we're making safety improvements on streets, I think what we can say with complete streets is that we're giving safety to everybody. We're not taking anything away from people in cars. We're giving safety to everyone. I think that's an important piece to always bring up in performance measurement. And then the final thing I was going to mention before I get into the quick Oakland case study is the over-reliance on, or level of service is overly reliant on a single point analysis. It estimates delay at a single intersection, but it doesn't consider how people move throughout the network. And so if you add delay to a single intersection, but the time it takes to travel down a corridor doesn't change, then people won't know the difference. And if there are alternative streets, next to the street, then people will shift their patterns. And so thinking about things only in terms of isolated intersections is not indicative of the way that people experience the transportation network. And so our performance metrics should think more at a network level and less at a point level. So I wanted to close by spending a couple of minutes talking about how we approach this on one particular street in Oakland. And so very quick context on the project itself. Telegraph Avenue is a street like many other streets in the United States. It started off with streetcars, a lot of commercial districts. There was decay in the middle of the 20th century as automobiles took over, and now it's being revitalized. The design of Telegraph Avenue has not changed over the last 45 years. However, it's the same as it was in 1971. It's a five-lane street with moderate amounts of traffic volume, 12 to 25,000 cars a day, depending on where you are on the corridor. While the design has not changed, the function of the street has changed considerably. So bicycling is up 300% in the last 15 years on the street. We now have over 130 bicyclists per hour during the peak hour. And I mentioned revitalization on the corridor. Every time a new business opens, there are new pedestrians walking along the street and trying to cross the street. And so we went through a planning process last year and got approval to do a 5-lane to 3-lane conversion with parking-protected bike lanes, a combination of parking-protected bike lanes and buffered bike lanes, and a number of other safety improvements. So that's just a little bit of context. I wanted to primarily talk about how we approach the performance metrics to get to what was a fairly significant decision for the City of Oakland to do such a large lane reduction on what is classified as the principal arterial in the city. So there are 3 things that we really did, which I'll go through each of them here. Is thinking about safety, thinking about the design year, and thinking about the type of traffic analysis that we do. So everything that we did around Telegraph Avenue for the performance metrics was focused on safety first, and that was the information we provided first in all of our reports, all of the public meeting materials, every talk that we gave about the project was about safety. And we have one bicyclist per month injured on the corridor. We have 1 pedestrian per month injured on the corridor, and that's not acceptable. And bringing that message out repeatedly, I think nobody can argue that is an acceptable outcome. And when you start the conversation with that, it helps build some momentum for change. Number 2, and I think this is really important, probably the biggest thing that we did as part of the project is, we happen to have good historical volumes on Telegraph Avenue going back about 45 years. And what they show is that as parallel freeways were opened in the 60s and 80s, traffic volumes declined. And then they haven't changed at all over the last 25 years. So we have a situation now where traffic is about 30% less on Telegraph Avenue than it was 50 years ago. Yet when we looked at the countywide travel demand model, it told us the traffic on Telegraph Avenue was going to be 217% higher in 20 years. That's 1% growth per month for the next 20 years. And so what we did was ignore that information. Our design year for Telegraph Avenue is today. That we have an existing problem where real people are being injured on the street, and we can't ignore that problem so that drivers who haven't been born yet can avoid congestion for 15 minutes a day 25 years from now. And that was something that we did consistently, and I think it was the first time in Oakland that we've used just a existing year, design year, and it made a huge amount of difference in kind of the outcomes of the metrics, or the evaluation metrics. And then I do want to mention that doing a project like this, we still do traffic analysis in Oakland. We're not going to take away lanes on a major street without doing some analysis of how that is going to affect traffic flow. And we still use level of service. I would like us to get to a point where we're using corridor-based measures and instead of intersection measures, but we're not there yet. But what we have done and what we did on this project is we did use the peak hour and not the peak 15 minutes. That means simply that we set the peak hour factor to 1, and so looking at the peak hour instead of the peak 15 minutes can make quite a bit of difference in a lot of cases. And we also made a policy decision, as Oakland previously was level of service D or better as a standard, and we made a policy decision to switch that to level of service E or better. So I'm not going to argue that this is the ideal way to do traffic analysis. It still has many of the flaws associated with level of service, but it is a significant step forward. So I would suggest that it's always beneficial to take that step forward if it's moving you toward the ideal, and not wait around for the perfect solution. Adjust the way that you're doing things incrementally when you can to get better outcomes. Yeah, and so to quickly summarize, the basic principle with performance measurement is that you want metrics that help you achieve your goals. And so you need to think carefully for every project about what are you trying to achieve with the project, and then pick metrics that will help you achieve that. And in most cases, that's not going to be simply level of service. And it's also important to challenge assumptions, whether it's the assumption that vehicle delay is the only thing that matters, or if it's a planning forecast that says the traffic is going to double in 20 years, there's no reason to accept those at face value. It's important to think about whether or not they make sense in your particular context. And as project managers, as people developing these projects, I think it's mostly important for you to take responsibility for the outcomes, that you can't say that level of service made you do it. We have the ability as transportation professionals to get to different outcomes, and we need to take responsibility for that. So I think we're taking questions at the end, but that's everything that I have for now.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, we're taking questions at the end, and thanks for being right on time. So I'll give it over to Eric Hanss from Chicago DOT now.
All right. Thanks, Ivana, and thanks, TRB and NACTO, for having me. I look forward to the opportunity to learn from all of you. Thanks to Jamie, too, for putting a great base on why we're doing this and thinking about things in the big picture. I'm going to talk maybe in a more constrained way about how Chicago uses safety as a performance measure and how we use it in our project selection and in our design criteria. So just as an overview, I want to first talk about our 0 and 10 approach that describe how Chicago is implementing Vision Zero, then drill down into our infrastructure project planning and enforcement and education, how we use safety to inform both of those, and then a couple of takeaways that we've come across in the past over the past couple of years of our work. Okay, so safety. Chicago has a 0 and 10 goal, which is a Vision Zero type goal, to eliminate traffic fatalities in 2022. There's a lot of nationwide momentum around Vision Zero, which sets goals to end traffic fatalities and make the safety of vulnerable users the cornerstone of design enforcement and education. There's been a lot of great leadership now through the Vision Zero network, and some high-profile cases where mayors are coming out strong on Vision Zero, especially in New York and San Francisco, and there's a lot happening now online in LA, Seattle, Portland, and there's a lot of discussion in cities nationwide and in Canada, and of course there are our international parallels. So our Vision Zero strategy, 0 and 10, was laid out in our pedestrian plan, which was launched in 2012. It focused predominantly on pedestrians, but in 2013 was upgraded to all modes. And that was through our Chicago Forward Action Agenda. Our action agenda also set a 10% annual reduction of roadway crashes and injuries performance measure that our department tries to hit using a safety-first approach. So just on Vision Zero, a lot of people, when we talk about it, say, well, how are you ever going to reach zero fatalities? That's crazy. And the core philosophy that we espouse is that all these crashes are preventable. They're not the result of accidents. We want to have vision around this topic. the goal is important. It's human life. It's well-being not only for individuals and families, but communities, and to pass off traffic fatalities as accidental and the cost of doing business is we just don't find it acceptable in light of what we know about roadway user response to environmental cues and a lot of other things. So how are we going to do it? We have everything is laid out in a couple of plans. I'll show you those in a second. But we do annual evaluation of our top crash locations, implementing quick cost improvements, and quick low-cost improvements. We're planning for longer-term redesign, but sometimes those take longer and operate over longer timelines. We do a lot of field fatality visits. We've established automated enforcement programs, both our safety zones, which are speed cameras, and our red light camera program. And then we have targeted in-person enforcement education. So throughout, we use a holistic design philosophy and also try to aim for complete streets, not only in design, but in maintenance and operation of the public way. So how does Chicago stack up? What is the extent of our issue? Nearly 3,000 pedestrians are involved in crashes every year in the city of Chicago, which amounts to 8 people a day. Of course, these crashes impact families, individuals, and communities. So safety is really paramount, not only when we're talking about human life, but also to the walkability and livability of the areas of our city. For fatalities, we are the fourth lowest. We have the fourth lowest pedestrian fatality rate of U.S. cities over 500,000. This was in the period between 2008 and 2012, where most of the data is available. So we are off the national trend, actually, in that we are declining, though we have nationwide, we've seen a little bump up in pedestrian fatalities, especially. Sometimes the year-to-year is difficult to look at, so if we bring out a bigger, more robust trend where we incorporate incapacitating injuries as well as fatalities, we can see that we're going down, but we flattened out, so we have a lot of work to do. This is a critical task for CDOT. So let's talk about how we're going to get there. We don't have a Vision Zero strategy that's laid out in one document per se. All of the documents that we use that guide our work, be it bike planning, pedestrian planning, or our roadway design and operations, are guided by a safety-first approach. So these are laid out in our Complete Streets Chicago Design Guidelines, our pedestrian plan, and our Streets Recycling 2020 plan. So let's talk about infrastructure first. That's my core area of focus. So Chicago's Complete Streets Design Standards set a pedestrian-first policy. So from capital all the way to maintenance, our streets are optimized for pedestrians first, then transit, bicycles, and people who choose to drive. We find it important to design forgiving streets for the most vulnerable users, knowing that if we design for the most vulnerable users, everybody will be accommodated. As Jamie said, you may have to slow down a little bit, but the safety of all users will be accommodated. And Chicago has had a Complete Streets policy since 2006. Designed a lot of streets under that Complete Streets policy, some with more safety parameters than others. This is an example look. This was Congress Avenue, which is a project that went in a couple of years ago. Another project you might have heard from Chicago is our Dearborn Protected Bike Lanes. And these are roadways that are designed for all users, although this particular example shows that we have a lot of traffic on the street, very high ADT, but we've been able to accommodate bikes and pedestrians in a robust way. So some of the improvements that we put in for quick hit safety improvements, we use a pretty typical toolbox that's probably very familiar to a lot of you listening in. But each of these, of course, has a cost constraint, and they have to be put in at the locations where they have the most amount of benefit. So through our project planning, we maintain a specific focus on crashes. So in our project selection, we identify and promote projects that advance complete streets, but we really rely on the analysis that we've done on high crash corridors and intersections to bump a project up to the top of the list, depending on whether the available funding has the right countermeasures in the scope for that corridor. And in scoping, we look at where the opportunities are. So do we have the countermeasure available to address the safety problem that we've found through crash analysis, crash mapping, and field survey. So Chicago's crash corridors, we define these once every few years, depending on the availability of data. We're getting to an every year model. We define about 12 high crash corridors in the city every time and roughly 25 high crash intersections. To do so, we look at the citywide KSI density, so serious and fatal injury density, and then we also, which gives us a target list, which we then evaluate against each other by weighting KSI crashes with all crashes per mile. And these are specifically for pedestrians. The pedestrian program focuses does most of the high crash corridor work, understanding that vulnerable user safety will lead to safety for everybody else. So how are we doing? Our first crash corridor analysis in 2005 to 2009, we've addressed 92% of the corridor, so we just missed one. We are going to address that in our next work plan, and we're doing slightly less well on our high crash intersections. Some of them have just been difficult to target because of the availability of funding and the scope that we have. Funding sources that we use are pretty typical. The list is on the left of the screen. Some of these are state-specific, but we're rolling out a lot more highway safety improvement projects and working more closely with local funding sources. So to identify our crash areas, we've been using a pretty crude model, just the number of crashes. We want to get into a more sophisticated look using pedestrian exposure, especially at our intersections and along our corridors. How many crashes are happening per pedestrian, per 100,000 or million pedestrian crossings? We want to get an order of magnitude so we can compare our downtown locations, which probably have way more pedestrians. We don't necessarily know that, though, so we don't want to make that assumption, to a neighborhood-based corridor, one that would be on the south side of the city or the far north side or the west side. So to do that, we need to gather more data on our number of crossings. So we've established a volunteer count program. We're expanding it. We've laid out a methodology where we can take volunteer counts, and this methodology is based on the great work that's been done by SafeTrek at UC Berkeley and through the National Bike Ped Documentation Project, which is run by ALTA and ITE. And we've developed a methodology where we can compare all of our locations that we've done through volunteers. These are all intersection counts with locations that we've collected data at for different projects and engineering studies. We also, for projects that we might get a funding source in that cannot specifically cover, such as a federal earmark, that can't cover an explicit high crash corridor as identified in our high crash corridor surveillance, but we can then vet that local area against a more holistic view of the roadway network that accounts for the safety, doesn't necessarily take safety as its primary concern, but also uses variables to indicate what's the connectivity of the local street network, what is the transportation equity, what is the health of the people in the community, and then we can evaluate programs based on projects based on that, and then cite accordingly. We also use prioritization models if a potential infrastructure countermeasure is available as a unit count, 200 pedestrian countdown timers across the city of Chicago, and that is crash weighted as well. We also do priority models for leading pedestrian intervals, also by crashes and signal retimings if we have areas where there are high numbers of seniors. So we want to get more sophisticated with how we do the sensing so we can cite our projects and expenditures accordingly. We want to use those pedestrian crash rates, as I was talking about earlier, to inform our long-range work plan. We want to update our PED plan tool and our methodologies. I think a lot of cities are coming up with really excellent ways and more robust ways than we currently are using to detect high crash corridors, and I'd love to discuss that with everybody more. There is a web-based crash analysis platform that New York DOT and SFMTA have rolled out that are both very impressive. They give a lot of tools to project managers as well as the public, so we would like to build that here in Chicago. And then the HSM Highway Safety Manual lays out a lot of great predictive models that we'd like to explore in more detail. And then we're working with our Department of Public Health to explore the feasibility of cross-linking crash data and hospitalization data so we can get at-risk populations and that sort of thing that we can't typically get with crash data itself. So there are even better ways which we can be targeting specific populations or specific areas of the city, and we'd like to explore that. So just very quickly, we do have enforcement and education initiatives which are also guided by our crash data. We do a DDAX, or Data-Driven Approaches to Crime and Traffic Safety style enforcement program with one of our special police units that looks at the intersection between crime and traffic crashes and deploys traffic officers accordingly to provide eyes on the street and also to cite drivers, knowing that there's a high linkage between crime and crashes. We also deploy police to do high visibility crosswalk enforcements. We do about 100 of these a year with lots of citations. These are very popular and they're well requested by aldermen, but they're ultimately guided by the number and severity of pedestrian crashes at uncontrolled crossings throughout the city. We have a safety marketing campaign that is now morphing into a 0 and 10 or Vision Zero style campaign that we've been doing since 2011, a different look every summer, but we're going to try to hone in on a specific Vision Zero message this year, probably later in the season, so please expect to hear more about that. And then preliminary takeaways, just very briefly. Now that we're a couple years into our program, so we could say that we started in 2011 or 2012, we've learned a couple of lessons. What do we want in a successful 0 and 10 or Vision Zero implementation? We want timeliness of project delivery, comprehensiveness of project delivery. Did we address the whole corridor? Do we use all the countermeasures at hand? And we want to know, so to do both of those things, there are a lot of different things you have to first consider while setting up your Vision Zero program. Your municipal structure is first. So Chicago has a pretty atypical system of very localized control through our aldermen. So how does that impact? That highly impacts our program and our ability to systematically roll out these Vision Zero, 0 and 10 high crash corridor improvements. But that's a constraint, and we work within that constraint to implement projects. Federal and state funding sources can be really great source of funds, but maybe scope constrained, and they're very dependent on how supportive your state DOT is, specifically regarding their design guidelines, whether they recognize a countermeasure that you want to lay out, and their processing requirements can also be really big. So what we've learned is jurisdiction for our improvement projects, keeping that in mind for the timeliness of rollout. It's also important that contracts, procurement, and maintenance channels are set up for your countermeasures in advance of the project, or else that can really slow a project down. And then are your priorities shared by everybody within your department and in other departments? Do you have the capacity to, and the education amongst your staffing to implement complete streets and implement Vision Zero properly? Chicago, for instance, has a very big priority on violent crime reduction, so having our police department, bring our police department on board, it may not be their priority. We do work very, very closely with them, but that is a hurdle that we have to understand to make progress with them, knowing that they may not share exactly our emphasis. And it's really great to see mayors centrally supporting Vision Zero across the country, and we look forward to having more buy-in, hopefully in Chicago, moving forward. So, and then I guess I know I didn't talk too much about performance measures per se and measuring our efficacy. We are kind of for a few years out of doing that just because of crash data lag and slow project implementation for some of our big Vision Zero projects, and we hope to have that soon. So again, thanks a lot for the opportunity and look forward to all the presentations.
All right, thank you, Eric. Thanks for Jing and Eric for staying in time. And I'd like to invite Shaunna Burbidge from Active Planning to join us now and present.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, we're good. Let me see if I can figure out how to minimize this so that you're not seeing it on your screen. Whatever, we'll make it go away. I'm going to be talking today about measuring public health outcomes of multimodal transportation investments. And with that, I want to start with a quote. If I can, there we go, make it go away. Dr. Richard Jackson of UCLA once said that if a 70-year-old woman walking down the street on a hot day collapsed of heat stroke, the doctor in the emergency room would write death by heat stroke. He wouldn't write lack of trees, poor urban planning, or a lack of public transportation. And, you know, we've always, those of us that kind of look at this connection between the built environment and public health, we always kind of laugh about this, but it's so very true. And I think that as planners, as we become more cognizant of the reality of what our environments look like and the impact that those environments can have on our health and on the public health as a whole, we can make great strides to improving conditions for everyone. Okay. So how does transportation impact health? There are a number of ways, and I just want to touch briefly on these. I don't want to go into too much depth because we don't have a whole ton of time today. But the transportation impacts of health begin with transportation investments. We decide where we're going to put our money. That in turn leads to land use patterns. We all know if we didn't have a freeway off-ramp, we probably wouldn't have motels and gas stations and all of the associated land uses that tend to spring up around a freeway off-ramp. That also shapes people's travel behavior because people can only behave within the system that they're given. And so if you make it incredibly easy to drive a car and incredibly difficult to walk or ride a bike, people are going to drive. You're channeling that travel behavior based on the existing conditions. Our travel behavior then leads to health. In our country, we spend more time driving than any other industrialized nation in the world. That leads to things such as the obesity epidemic, lack of physical activity, which drives up our healthcare costs. You know, when you're overweight, you have increased susceptibility to illness, you spend more time at the doctor, and those costs increase. So what are some of the specific impacts on health? Just to give you, kind of the broad spectrum, we have safety. We just heard a great presentation on safety. Currently, traffic crashes account for over 40,000 deaths per year in our country. Air quality is another huge one that a lot of people don't typically think about. I'm just north of Salt Lake City, and in the wintertime, we get inversions which lead to some of the worst air quality in the entire country. And so we're very cognizant here of the impact that air quality and transportation have on our health. Currently, 35 million people live within about 300 feet of a major roadway. You think about the pollution and the emissions of those fuels and breathing all of that in, breathing in those particulate matter that comes from tires and from everything else that we have from this auto-dominant transportation system. Physical activity is another big one. Right now, a third of adults are estimated to be obese, another third are overweight. I think I read an article a couple days ago that we're creeping up on close to 75% of the U.S. population that is categorized as overweight now. A lot of this is due to sedentary lifestyles. We don't get enough physical activity. We don't have opportunities to walk and to bike that were part of our daily routine in years past. And lastly, equity. We have problems with low-income, non-driving, ethnic minority populations that are less likely to get the benefits from road investments. They may be the ones that end up in the neighborhoods without the investment, and they're also reaping the negative adverse impacts of these transportation systems. So I want you to think about the area where you live and how healthy we really are and how healthy are our designs. Let's first think about how healthy are our communities. The first presentation that was given was fantastic, and it kind of made me laugh because we really do plan for those peak days. You look at this first photo of a Kmart, and that parking lot and parking requirements in general are typically planned for, that day after Thanksgiving. The one day a year where we're going to have peak travel demand, peak traffic, and by heavens, we need to accommodate all of those cars. But then what we end up with is the 99% of the rest of the time where the parking lot is half empty or more. And what does that do to accommodating pedestrians and cyclists? We have this concrete paving over our landscape, and not only does it create a very auto-centric environment, but it also focuses heavily on promoting heat islands, runoff that gets into bad water quality. There's a whole number of health impacts that can come from these design decisions. How healthy are our buildings? This is actually a 24-hour fitness in San Diego, and I've always gotten a kick out of the fact that, you know, people are going to the gym to exercise, but yet they need escalators because they just can't put forth the physical activity to walk up that lovely flight of stairs to get into the gym to exercise. And then lastly, how healthy are our lifestyles? We see in this third photo, you know, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek where this gentleman or a lady is walking their dog in their car. But that's really the point that we've gotten to. You know, we've created communities where the healthy choice isn't necessarily the easy choice. So there are a number of tools that have been coming about to help us deal with these issues. You know, now we're backpedaling from the types of communities that we've created and said, you know what, we can do better. But how do we know that we can do better? One of the major tools that's gaining steam in the major circles, you know, through TRB and through the public health circles, is the use of a health impact assessment. And you can see the technical definition on the screen. It says that it's a combination of procedures, methods, tools by which a policy or program can be judged based on their potential effects of population health and the distribution of effects. We look a little bit at equity with that as well. These are only for large-scale, typically these are only for large-scale projects, similar to an environmental impact assessment. But what we wanted to know in the Salt Lake City metropolitan region was, how can we use a health impact assessment on a micro scale? You know, is this really only for a large scale project, or can we use it on a small scale project? I know that in Northern California, they've had cases where they've tried to implement a health impact assessment even on the construction of a single building. You know, what are the health impacts of this construction project going to be? And you can have some pretty miraculous findings when you take it from that huge macro scale down to a micro scale. But then the last question becomes, how do we use these in a practical way? You can see the steps of a typical HIA on the left-hand side of your screen, and it pretty much follows an EIS or the CEQA process for those of you in California, only with regard to health outcomes rather than environmental outcomes. And so how can we use this to our advantage when we're planning transportation projects? Well, I want to talk to you today about a project that we recently completed in Utah called the Utah Collaborative Active Transportation Study, or UCAT for short. And you can see in the map, the study area was huge. If anyone's ever been to Utah, this makes up about this encompasses about 95% of the state's population in this corridor. So it's a 90-mile corridor, covers 5 counties, 94 municipalities and townships, and 10 designated census places that aren't quite large enough to be considered a municipality or township or are unincorporated. You can see by the placement, we're just to the east of the Great Salt Lake along the Wasatch Mountain Range. The point of the UCAT study was to do a comprehensive study looking at bicycle facilities. We know that local facilities are fantastic, but for a lot of people, they want to be able to commute by bike. They want to be able to get from point A to point B. And if we don't have an interconnected network that allows people to go greater distances, then it's not going to happen. The other thing that we wanted to look at were the demonstrated economic, health, and environmental benefits of the transportation system and how we could look at bicycle impacts and infrastructure impacts in a different way. It should be noted that this was a huge, I mean, you can see from the title, it's the Utah Collaborative Active Transportation Study, and that's very true. This was a collaboration between UDOT, UTA, which is our transit agency, the Wasatch Front Regional Council, the Mountain Land Association of Governments, which are the 2 MPOs that cover the study area, and Salt Lake County, which is located pretty much in the center of the blue study area there. It has the highest population density of that corridor, and so we wanted to make sure that they played a significant role in and having a seat at the table. So looking at the UCAT's health impact analysis, we wanted to use local and specific data. That was very important. You can't use generalized data for something like this. We also wanted to bring into play state-of-the-art techniques, things that were coming out of the literature. There's a lot of research being done, and there's no reason to overlook all of those wonderful tools, and so we wanted to be able to integrate those into this project. Through that study area, after a number of data collection methodologies were applied prior to the health impact point, 25 generalized projects were identified. So out of that whole study area, we found 25 areas that needed something. We did not identify a specific project, but these were just general, like what would happen if we did something here? We're not necessarily going to call it a trail or a buffered bike lane or sharrows on the road, but we're just going to call it a general project. That added to the complexity of this process. But we wanted to make sure that we gave ourselves some wiggle room on the other end to be able to decide what was most context appropriate. The next step was to quantitatively estimate the potential positive health outcomes. It's really easy to say, like, oh, trails are great. They're going to make everyone healthier. You know, it's the old if you build it, will they come argument of, well, do healthy people live in areas where this infrastructure exists, or does putting in the infrastructure actually make them healthier? So we wanted to be able to do this in a quantitative way. And then lastly, we wanted to create a measurement tool that would allow us to compare all 25 of these sites to prioritize and figure out where we were going to get the most bang for our buck based on location. So looking at the factors that went into our HIA model that I created for this project. The first was the potential facility characteristics. So we didn't know what kind of a facility it was going to be, but we could identify things such as the corridor length, the amount of land area that we were dealing with, etc. So we're not, you know, we knew if it was going to be a quarter-mile facility, if it was a site around a transit station, or if it was going to be something longer along a longer corridor. The next thing we looked at were proximity to schools, parks, and open space, because these are destinations for active modes. And so we know that there's going to be a bigger return on investment if you're connecting people to these types of locations. Again, residential density. We want to know how many people lived within access of these proposed project sites. Proximity to healthcare facilities. This included routine care, urgent care, hospitals, all of the different types of healthcare facilities. We know from the research that lower income individuals and individuals that have health issues typically may be reliant on transit. They may not be able to drive, and so being able to provide access to healthcare facilities via active modes becomes critical. Current population health surrounding the sites. We used BRFSS data for that. That's a survey conducted by all of the health departments. The acronym stands for the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, and it measures levels of obesity, diabetes, physical activity, all of high blood pressure, all of those types of things across the board. And so we incorporated existing population health into the model so that we could help predict the return on investment for health. The next factor was demographic characteristics. We know that demographics play a huge role in whether or not people will choose to walk or bike or use transit. Environmental impacts, that's another one that was a little bit tricky in looking at within a model, because we looked at air quality. As I mentioned, our region has very bad air quality in the winter months. And so that's something that we needed to take into account, because when you shift people from driving, you reduce emissions, but during certain times of the year, if people stop driving and start biking, now they're breathing in all of the bad air from the emissions while they're riding a bike. And so there's kind of a catch-22, and there's a cost benefit that had to be incorporated in the analysis. The next is the potential mode deviation. So if we put a facility in on this corridor, what amount of mode split shift are we going to have from car trips to bike trips or transit, etc.? You know, what could we reasonably expect from a facility in this location? And then the last thing we really focused on was accessibility to transit. So by putting in, you know, a facility, are we going to be able to get people to the light and commuter rail stations, or get them to bus stops so that then they can use a linked trip to and have an active access to transit to get them to their final destination. Some of the challenges that I've kind of mentioned already, a lot of the variables required a transformation or a weighting. So population health, you can't just say, okay, this area's population health equals 5. It doesn't work that way. When you're dealing with, rates of obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, physical inactivity, also environmental health exposure risk, these all required some elasticities. And so we had to create several models within the model to create values for those variables. Again, it was very complex due to the relationships. How does air quality improvement change when we get that mode split that reduces auto travel? It's just a kind of a can of worms, and every time you introduce a new variable, you have to account for movement throughout the rest of your variables, and there's a lot of collinearity involved. Again, a big challenge, the facility types were unknown. I was doing an analysis where my team said, okay, we're going to put something on this road. And I said, well, what are you going to put in? Are you going to put in, a class 1 trail? Is this going to be a bike boulevard? Or are you going to put up signs that say, bike lane? Because that's a big difference. And so I had to be able to accommodate in this model all of the variations that could exist within different facility types. And that was definitely a challenge. Inability to predict changes in travel behavior. We know that travel behavior is a very complex thing and that it's hard to anticipate what changes are going to have an impact at the personal level. And then again, controlling for collinearity and avoiding overrepresentation of one variable. The last thing we wanted was to have, physical inactivity levels rule the day in the model. And so we had to be very careful about balancing the impact of each variable to ensure that one variable that had a very strong outlier effect didn't take over the rest of the model and create kind of a false positive, if you will. So after we ran all 25 sites through our model, we ended up with 3 categories. And we had low value sites. And these were areas, don't get me wrong, these were not areas that had no positive health outcome. These were simply sites where the area around the project already had relatively high levels of physical activity, pretty healthy population, or they were located in rural areas where we just weren't going to see as big of a return on investment for new infrastructure. Medium value, these are sites that had mode differences in public health, just kind of middle of the road. Like, yeah, you see some value, but not huge. And then the high value sites, improved conditions would have substantial benefits. In some cases, a single, yes.
Shaunna, we'll have to wrap it up. I'm really sorry for interrupting you because we're slowly running out of time. So
okay, let me just give my conclusions real quick. It'll take 2 seconds, and then we'll wrap it up. I apologize. Modeling health outcomes is complex. I've mentioned a lot of the drawbacks, but this was a huge benefit to the project because we were able to identify these high-value sites. Here's an example of one of them where we learned that putting an active transportation corridor in this location would have a significant health care benefit to the surrounding population. If anyone has any questions, I know this is a very complex study to try to cram into 15 minutes, so I'm happy to answer questions. You can email me or call me, and I have the whole final report if you want more information.
All right. Thank you so much, Shaunna and Eric and Jamie. These were great presentations and great and diverse insights and topics. I'd like to invite the audience now for questions for our presenters. So please go ahead, and I'll say out loud I'll read out loud every question that you might have that you type in here. Okay, Corinne, are you there? Do we have any questions?
Yep, here, I'll read them out for you. This question's for Eric and Jamie. Is geographical or political equity a performance measure that's taken into account with your projects, or do you focus on improving the worst areas first, regardless of location?
Well, this is Jamie. I would say that geographic and political, or particularly political equity, is something that comes up. We don't really have to explicitly incorporate that because it's going to find our way. It's going to find its way into into how we prioritize our funding at the end of the day anyway. We don't really have much control over that. So that's a factor that we just have to deal with in Oakland as part of city politics.
This is Eric. For the most part, our high crash corridors intersect with areas of existing low equity. So when we are prioritizing based on high crash patterns, we are intrinsically working to rebalance the equity in those areas. We do have intense political equity that we have to work with too, just based on our system of local government. And we do that is a major factor in deciding where to site projects and build projects.
A question here for Shaunna. How have health benefits been integrated into the planning process? And are there examples of cities adopting this as a metric?
Yes, actually, we have quite a few cities along Utah's Wasatch Front, our urban core, who have started looking at health as a major performance measure. You know, there are some areas, obviously, that have public health issues within their jurisdiction, and so they're looking at ways that they can incorporate more active transportation, active access to transit, access to these healthcare facilities. The neat thing about our project is that we were able to prioritize out of those 25 sites to those areas that kind of rose to the top in the health analysis, and we've already secured funding to be able to go in and put some projects in those areas to help improve health.
This is Eric just jumping in. Chicago is conducting its first health impact assessment for a trail along an old rail embankment in one of our Southside communities, and that's been a really interesting process for us. We're working more with our DPH to work on health-based project development. They've been really supportive, and I know that there are a lot of other DPHs, especially LA, who have been very involved.
Great. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, so there's a few other questions. But what we'll do is we'll provide contact information and a recording of the webinar so that you can get in touch with any further questions. Ivana, do you have any last words?
I'd just like to thank everyone for attending and all the speakers for really wanting to answer the questions even after the webinar is done. Thank you for the great presentations, and thanks, Corinne, for the technical support and for reading the questions and for all your help. Thanks, everyone. And the next webinar is on September 16, and the topic is Urban Success Stories. So it's going to be about successful multimodal projects in different cities across the U.S., so please join us.